Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank. I almost forgot my show name. Jessica, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I got a topic for you. It's new. It's trending. By the time this comes out, it might be a couple of weeks later. But it's the ship that was found. Is it James Cook?
James Cook ship, yeah.
What is that? Who? What? Why? Who? What? Where? When? How?
Who, what, when, where, how? So James Cook's ship is like he was an explorer, and he is famous for like doing a lot of exploration in the South Pacific. Like he was in Australia and he was in the French Polynesian Islands, and he did all this exploration, and then he kind of just like disappeared. And so they knew that he was like somewhere in the Americas and that he was likely like somewhere in New England. And so people have been looking for his ship for a really long time. And there's actually a lot of debate if this is actually the ship.
Because Australia found them, didn't they?
Well, so that's the thing, is they think that it might be in Rhode Island. And then they're like, oh, but it could be here, it could be there. So the problem with wooden shipwrecks is that they all kind of like look the same, right? Like underwater. And so when you're trying to confirm that like a wooden shipwreck is the shipwreck that you're actually looking for, it takes a lot. So you need to have things like all of the measurements from the ship, any artifacts they were, the last known location, just tons and tons of kind of clues to really confirm that like this is the ship. And because we don't know where James Cook's ship sank, we can just kind of like use our best guesses. And so the team who's been working on this has been working on it for a long time. And they feel really confident that this is James Cook's ship, but kind of the other James Cook historians out there they're just not convinced. So it's kind of like a debate.
Is it like a town pride thing? You know, we're like, oh, I grew up in the town that won the football championship in 2014. This is kind of like that, where everyone wants claim to this thing as well too. And then if you have one person discovering it, people always want to be that person that kind of discovers this, which I've started to notice in academia. As much as we like to progress human species or whatever, it's more of seen of like, I want to be the person that gets to name that, which I'm not above them. I want to do that as well too. If I find a cool rock and no one's ever had a name for, it's definitely going to be named something after my last name or something.
Yeah, there is some of that. This is a team. And so the organization would love to like, this would really like be great for their organization. In archaeology, that kind of like putting an individual person's name on it and like holding on to things until you can claim the discovery is kind of like an older generation thing. And like people who are my age, some of them do want that, but it's more like collaborative. Just like the way that archaeology works now and the way it's funded and all of the different ways that you do it, there's no way one person can ever find anything, right? Like if you're going to go look for something in the middle of the ocean, like you can't just like, you're not the only person on the boat, like if you're using an ROV, like yes, you might be the archaeologist analyzing the footage, but like you're not driving the ROV, you're not driving the boat, you're not watching the navigations, you're not calibrating like all of the depth gauges and things for this piece of equipment. So like it's always like a team and collaborative effort. So there's some of that. I think that James Cook is just like a particularly like special character because he has like, it'd be like if someone was like, oh, we found George Washington's boat that you've been looking for, but it's actually like in,
you get canceled India. For that. People don't like George Washington anymore.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but like for Americans, like George Washington is like one of our founding fathers, right? So like if we had been looking for something related to George Washington for 100 years, and then they found it somewhere completely like not related to the United States, like people would be a little bit disappointed, right? Because they want to like keep everything like in. They want like, oh yeah, it's ours. So there's a little bit of that with James Cook, that like he's a much more prominent and important figure in Australia. And so I think it would be, there's just, they're just a little bit more hesitant to say like, yes, this is definitely his ship.
Yeah. I've been thinking about like the vast amount that I guess we really haven't really discovered about the ocean, but how many smugglers back in the day were traveling in between smuggling islands, and how many ships of those went down that people have probably found, but there's probably still a vast amount out there as well too. I mean, even if a location of a wreckage maybe was in a certain area, unless you're getting some person with like dowsing rods that can track a crash ship from like the 1800s or something out there on the top of the boat, like mounted, like how they had those bronze figurines, just with dowsing rods looking. Unless you get someone the remote viewing or doing these types of things that people like to go to the ends of the earth to try and do, just to be able to find this type of thing that's basically like buried treasure in a sense. I look at it like, I mean, you got to worry about floating or drifting from currents that's going to end up pushing that wreckage farther and farther and farther. It's definitely not going to be the same exact spot. But how many of like just I mean, even a smallest thing like a smuggler's like boat or something like that, where there was maybe they found a jug of whiskey or something on it. To me, that would just be interesting in itself, because you never expected to go out there to find anything. You're hopeful for finding something, but then if you actually find even anything, a small pocket watch, there's just curiosity that comes with it that keeps you incentivizing for going more. It's like a long time ago on the show, I talked to a bunch of fossil hunters for a brief period amount of time. And one of the things they were saying was, even if like they had a fossil, they would place one on the path for a small child just to be interested in going and looking, because everyone's excited when they find their first thing. It incentivizes and opens up the door for them to find more.
Yeah. I mean, there's some of that. Like there's definitely people out there who are into it for like the hunt and the chase of it. They don't always like necessarily use scientific methods to document what they find, which is when like kind of there's like a divide between people who do it for like an interest versus people who do it for a profession. As far as like smuggling stuff goes, the way that you and I think of smugglers is not like how smugglers kind of functioned pretty much up until like the 1850s. So, they're like, so my expertise is, in the transatlantic slave trade. When you were in school, somebody probably told you like, oh, the triangle trade, where they traded like sugar for rum, and then they went down and, took enslaved people and then brought them over. And it was this
Sorry.
kind of like going in a circle.
You usually have to follow that with like sorry, because every time I talk to someone who studies anything with like slaves, they immediately start going, and then the white man came through, and then it's like they're looking for me to apologize, and I'm like,
Oh no, I'm not looking for you
okay,
to apologize. I mean, like it is a hard
yeah,
topic. But I think the thing that we can do is like acknowledge that like it happened and it was horrible, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of all of that, of what it meant. But and actually this is like very timely, because National Geographic, their issue this month is about some really amazing archaeologists and divers who are looking for slave ships that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and like really doing like really cool, really amazing work. And they actually have like a 6-part podcast that they're doing about it, which if anybody is interested, I would really encourage them to listen to. Like you'll just learn so much. And also the people who are doing this are colleagues of mine, but they're just like really amazing human beings who do really, really good archaeology. So they're pretty cool.
I'm about to say, I don't think we've ever specifically talked about on your first episode. I think we were more focused around the area of cruise ships and why you should never go on them, because anybody that goes out to sea never comes back. But what specifically did you study about like the transatlantic? Is it the transatlantic slave trade?
Yes.
Okay.
So what I studied was I looked at ship construction. And so this kind of also ties into the smuggling thing. There is this kind of like preconceived notion that there's no ships that like were purposely built to participate in the transatlantic slave trade, which to me was always like just nonsense. Like here's this, like, for the purpose of this conversation, here's this industry that had been going on for hundreds of years. It's not like it was only a few years or a short amount of time, for hundreds of years, that started off as a trickle and then got bigger and bigger and bigger. You can't tell me that these people who are, spending what would equate today to millions of dollars on this industry didn't purposely build their ships to maximize their profits.
Well, it's like riding a
So
bike to work every single day, and you look at your lawnmower and wonder if you can put that motor on your bike.
yeah, or saying like, I'm gonna ride my, I'm gonna start out riding a bike, right? And then I'm gonna start with my mountain bike or my beach cruiser. But after a while, I'm like, oh, I probably need different tires. And then after a little bit while, I'm like, oh, it'd be easier if I had a lighter frame. And then eventually you get from a beach cruiser to a road bike, right? It's the same thing in shipbuilding. Yes, maybe you started out with like, yeah, this is just the ship that we have, and it has this carrying capacity and this kind of sails. But then as time goes on, just like anything else, the ship changes and evolves to the values that the person who's building it has. And those values for people who are trading in human lives is profit. So I looked at like documents and archaeological records across the transatlantic slave trade in the United States and England. Unfortunately, a lot of the records that are in like Spain and Portugal just like weren't accessible to me at the time. And a lot of them are actually in Brazil, and it's like a whole complicated thing. So I just looked at England and the United States. And what you see is that there's like this divergence between US shipbuilders and shipbuilders in the UK, and their whole methodology of how they do this is a little bit different. Shipbuilders in the US valued speed, shipbuilders in the UK valued size, shipbuilders in the US had more crew members that were more like security. There was always a surgeon or a doctor on board UK ships. So it's just, that's kind of what I studied and tried to put like a diagnostic guide together, because the other thing is ships very rarely only have one purpose in their life, right? It's like a used car. Like maybe you bought your truck to participate in your construction company, but then when you sold your truck, it became a family car, or it went to a farm, or, like they very rarely have just one purpose. So a lot of times when ships sink, unless, they're in a storm or whatever, or they're abandoned, they aren't serving the purpose that they were built for. And so one of the gaps in the archaeological record that we have is we don't have a ton of ships that we can say, hey, this ship participated in the transatlantic slave trade, even though we know there were thousands of ships that participated over hundreds of years, that span the entire, globe, the entire Atlantic world. So we're like, where are these ships? So my goal was to like say, okay, here's the features from this time period to this time period that these people were using. Here's the features that these folks were using, so that other archaeologists could say like, oh, I found this ship. I have no idea what it is. Maybe it's a smuggler ship. Maybe it's a warship. What is it? Okay, it's none of these things. It has no cannons, or, we can eliminate all these other types of ships. Oh, look, it has this feature. That is a feature indicative of ships that participated in the slave trade. So I spent like 5 years of my life working on that and doing that. And so, because like what we were talking about before with smuggling ships, it's not the way that we think of it now, right? Like maybe you did a trip from the Bahamas to New England and you were bringing up rum or something. But then, you decided you didn't want to like pay the taxes. So you kind of like skirted and went into a secret harbor and unloaded there so you wouldn't have to pay the port taxes. In antiquity, that is smuggling. When we think of smuggling today, we think of like, more secret, squirrely kind of like sneaking around. But like all smuggling really was avoiding paying the taxes on the cargo that you had. And so there's a lot of that happens, but specifically in like Rhode Island and New England, in the like 1600s, 1700s, early 1800s. And then if those ships sink, we don't know about it because you're not going to record that. But then there's a whole other part of it too, where there's like insurance fraud. So like, let's say you're losing a ton of money on
Titanic.
whatever you, yes, Titanic, but more before that, because by the time Titanic goes around, there's a lot more like regulatory. But you can be like, yeah, I'm gonna run this ship is gonna, go to Africa and bring back enslaved people one time, because that cargo is worth such and such amount. Okay. So then they get to wherever they're going, and then the ship sinks, but they were still able to offload, or it happened, like they don't know where it happened. And then those people can collect that insurance money. or they say it sank and they never actually went there and they never actually came back. And so there's also like, there's the smuggling aspect of it, there's an insurance fraud part of it, and then there's also like the actual horrific part of like trading in human lives.
So it's not that different from today where people are trying to find out the right information, but there seems to be a bunch of lying and cover-ups that start to end up happening. If you're going to say your ship went down for insurance fraud or never even go to the actual trip in the first place, all you got to do is be able to have a contact with that shipping dock person who's wherever you're supposed to go to and say, write down my name on the ledger to say that I showed up. It makes it difficult for looking back for historical reasons, only because it makes the information so scattered where you might be thinking, okay, we have this and this, that means it went this way. But then it was like, well, imagine if that person never went that way. You got to think of the people that are like the people you would come across that have street smarts. That's them back there just trying to avoid the tax that they feel like they didn't need to pay. It makes it a lot difficult for you guys. And then you got to think of like a Houdini type or some type of like mass thought creative person that's like, oh, I'm going to hit this back panel in my ship and it's where all our whiskey is going to be. So the front looks like this, but there's a fake wall and you push that. And then you're like, man, these people are onto something. I mean, that's got to be fascinating that the human mind still has capabilities where there were people like a Da Vinci style doing a whole different craft that just didn't get the, I guess, the name for it. I mean, have you ever came across something like a certain ship or something that had different modifications? I mean, we talked about their uses. For instance, a ship would have many uses. If you have a ship that's going to be transporting slaves, and you were mentioning how like there was a surgeon, you said in the UK there was surgeons on the ship, and then I'm guessing in the States they just looked at it more of a capacity issue. Instead of keeping the ones that you have alive healthy, just shove a whole bunch down there and whatever makes it there. The more you have in there, the more it makes it there.
So in the US, it was about speed. So their ships are like, they're trying to get across the Atlantic as quickly as possible. And then in the UK, the ships end up being larger with a surgeon saying like, we need to get as many individuals across as possible. So
all your eggs in one basket compared
to
having...
there is just like kind of two different ways. But the other part that I think is interesting is that their whole methodology completely relies on the individuals who they're kidnapping having no agency whatsoever, which there's like, it's something like 1 in 7 ships experienced an insurrection or an attempted insurrection from like the enslaved people. And so like, but they don't talk about it. Like they don't talk about it. They don't tell each other about it because it's like an embarrassment. Like, oh, I must not have been doing a good enough job because, you know, the people that I'm like forcefully ripping from their home tried to fight back. And so they never like, they do take some things into account, like they separate men and women, and they, you know, put shackles on some people and not on other people. And obviously there's tons of violence and starvation and just like really horrible things, but they like never they continuously forget to take into account that these are people who have agency, who can fight back. And especially the women, like they're not necessarily restraining the women in the same, you know, intense capacity that they are as the men. And the women have just as much agency as the men. Men are not the only people who can fight back, you know? So that's like an interesting part of it. But in terms of the features that you're talking about, I've never personally found anything like that. But you have to also remember that with very, very few exceptions, most shipwrecks, what we get is we don't actually get a lot of the superstructure. So there are some shipwrecks like you might have seen like the Vasa, which sank in a harbor that was super silty and just kind of like immediately filled with like silt and then sat there for a long time. And so it was just completely like the whole ship was intact because it just sank into like loose silty mud. In Charleston, where I worked for a couple of years, the ships there, like it's hard bottom. So the only part of the ship that remains is like what's underneath the ballast pile, which is the stones in the bottom of the ship that kind of stabilize it and give it the right equilibrium in the water. So all you get is the wood that's underneath those rocks. You don't get any of the superstructure. And so if it's dark and deep, like Titanic, right? If it's dark and deep, you might get more of the upper part of the ship. But if it's shallow and there's currents and there's storms and the bottom is hard and there's not like a lot of preservation methods in place, you don't kind of get that top part. So there's no like, as much as I would love to be like Ariel in the Little Mermaid, like swimming into this ship and like, you know, or like Elsa and finding the like secret compartment, you know, like there's just not, that just doesn't, we just don't find things like that. It's not to say that they don't exist, but it's just not something I've ever experienced. So yeah, I don't know.
Not only against, I would say you're not only fighting the ocean currents, but you're also fighting time as well too, because the longer it's down there, the harder it is to get more of whatever you're trying to, I guess, find in a sense. I mean, water has a corrosion method. I think we talked about your first episode where we talked about like if you took a sword that was covered in rust, you'd have to be careful pulling it out of the water to place it into something without it dissolving, just from the amount of time that it might have been down there. It's just interesting to see because like I really like talking about this type of stuff. It's just so hard to talk about like anything with the slave trade or anything like that, because then people get immediately like, I don't know if they're just hyped up because they want to look like that for social cues, but it's, I mean, it's an interesting topic, the way that people's minds were working back then. I mean, and it happened. You can't just forget about it. You should be able to talk about it as well too, especially the surgeon thing, like having a surgeon on in like the UK ships, for instance, I guess that was just to maintain and keep them healthy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. And I'm not to say that like slave ships are not particularly horrible places.
Well, having hygiene on a ship in general, like
Hygiene,
that's,
yeah,
yeah.
hygiene on a ship in general is very challenging, right? Like even today, people, if you get sick on a cruise ship, like there was like 30, 40, 50 people get sick, right? Having hygiene on a ship in general is very, very challenging. Which is where some of the first quarantines come from, right? Is that ships coming into port, there's all these different flags. You fly a flag saying someone on board has, let's just say for the sake of this conversation, the plague. That ship is going to sit in harbor and quarantine, and the harbor master is not going to let anybody on that ship off for a certain amount of time. That is like literally where quarantines kind of began, and why, to stop the spread of disease, because ships are carrying that illness from port to port, from place to place, and you're in close quarters and you're sharing communal food, and there's no like bathroom facilities. There's literally a thing called the poop deck. The reason it's called that is because people have to go over the side to use the facilities. Like, so it's not a particularly hygienic place. Then you take that and you multiply it by 100 by having people who are captive, who are locked in one place, who are only allowed on deck maybe for 10 or 15 minutes a day, who might not be allowed on deck for days or weeks at a time. Who have to sit in like their own kind of like filth, who are getting the bare minimum of nutritional value of food, who may not be getting water. And if supplies and rations start to go down, like, do you really think that the crew is going to prioritize these people who they don't even view as people over themselves? Like, of course not. So,
I was about to say, like with the ships for, oh, actually, no, continue your point. I just lost mine. Wonderful.
Okay, no worries. So the having the surgeon on board is like a precautionary measure to help keep some of these people alive, but also to keep the crew alive as well. Believe it or not, like finding crew, like there's like in maritime world, there's a total hierarchy of like sailors, not just on individual vessels, but on the kind of vessels that you work on and the kind of jobs that you have. And working on a slave ship is like not the top of the pile, and so a lot of crew members die on these voyages as well. Not even close to the number of enslaved people, but like the surgeons are there to keep the crew healthy and going, because they can't recruit new ones. If you're in the middle of the ocean and a bunch of your crew die, like you can't get new people to sail you the rest of the way, but also to maximize your profit, because the other really horrible thing that happens is you get to port, you offload your cargo, and someone else is there assessing the value of these individual people. And they decide, if what you did is a success or a failure. And so it is all profit generated and all profit motivated. Like, as much as I want to be like, yeah, the British had more humanity because they had a doctor on board, it's profit motivated. There is no humanity in it. And so, it's
Well, a
It's
lot of
really disgusting.
Yeah, a lot of issues with these topics, though, is that they boil down to what your personal kind of feelings are about this. And sadly, from when you're looking back in a historical perspective, you can't really put your personal thoughts into it. You really kind of have to put in the strategic sense in a lot of ways as well, too. I know that sounds horrible, even saying that. Like when I said it, the words just like they just it felt hollow coming out. But I mean, from a strategical aspect, which one's going to be, it's all about profit. And I mean, that's how it is now. It's why I can always usually rant about the stuff that happens now, because in the same sense, it's not much different than happens back in the day. It's all a money thing. And sadly, money is one of the best attractors. I mean, that's also what the thing with the ship we were talking about in the beginning. Someone's name on something or someone's name on a discovery is not seen in the human aspect of a beneficial thought to society. It's seen as a beneficial aspect of to them as well, too, or the team that finds it. Whether you want to donate the ship to a museum or not, you still get your claim on that. And sadly, everyone's looking at it like, I kind of want a piece of that claim. Um,
Well, none of the people who find it will make any money. Let's just put that out there. The
Historically,
reason,
value wise, though, if your name's in a magazine, that's
yeah,
value to me.
that's great. But again, like if you, for example, like if you're in National Geographic, they're not paying you, right? Like they might fund part of your research, but they're not like paying you individually. Like you don't get money or anything for being in the magazine or being associated with them. What you get is kind of like the prestige, the recognition of your achievement, and maybe some money towards your research.
That's
With
immortality. That's worth more than any money. I want a
well,
black
with
and white headshot with me holding a rose in my mouth and
that's
the
what you
back
want.
cover of National
I
Geographic.
think The Bachelor might be like a better. But with James Cook's ship, what could be potentially valuable in that is the opportunities for grants and funding to preserve that ship and its cargo, which again would not go to any individual, but that can also be a huge challenge. So, for example, the Hunley, right? This Civil War submarine, it sank the Housatonic in Charleston Harbor. That's kind of like the first documented case of a submarine sinking a ship. It's like a very big deal in terms of like technological innovation and all that. So they found the Hunley. It took a ton of money to raise it up. They've been working on it, on excavating the inside. They found human remains inside. They found the clothes, everything, because again, it filled instantly with silt. So they excavated it. They repatriated their remains. They did, reconstructions of what these people would have looked like. They preserved their clothes, their jewelry, their shoes. Then they completely preserved the ship, right? So that took 20 years. So now they're at a crossroads, right? Because all of the money that they had is going just to keeping this ship preserved and getting all the research done. They haven't even started on working on building the museum for it, getting it open to the public, all of that. So at the time when they found it, the people who found it were really excited. And some of them are my friends and they're really great people, but their names are not what you know, right? That what you know is the ship. And all of that is still like fundraising, donors, getting funding from the state of South Carolina, bringing in individual people who might want to contribute to this museum. Actually just saw today, like Jeff Bezos is giving $200 million to the Smithsonian so that they'll name one of the buildings after him. So you have to like play that game too, in addition to like finding the ship, studying the ship, identifying the ship, if you want to bring it up, open it up to the public, create a place, like a physical location for people to participate in this historic item.
It's a
So it
lot of
can
the
be really
problems.
complicated.
Well, there's a lot of problems that go with it. Also, the extensions on how much long time, I guess, how long things take when it comes to not only just funding, but also just trying to get maybe a research grant passed or something like that. It seems like there's a lot of extensions and time waiting where, you're saying that you can have funding for this, but then the museum's not built. There's always like a hurdle when it's like you guys might be rushing in one direction when rather trying to make sure that it all kind of falls together in the same amount of time.
Yeah, it is. There's always part like because it's always like continuing funding like to get to the end goal. And then even, when the museum is built, like it'll have to make money, right? Like you'll have to pay staff to be there, even if it's just somebody at the front desk and to keep the building clean. And um money in the historic world and archaeology and museums is great. And I think it's vitally important. Like our cultural history is really, really important. It teaches us, it shows us, and it makes it like come alive because you can actually interact with it. But at the end of the day, if you have to choose between building a hospital and building a museum, you're going to pick the hospital. You know, like if you need to decide between taking care of the people who are here now and historic artifacts or items or things that happened in the past, you're going to pick the people now. And as you absolutely should, but it doesn't devalue, you know, what the historic stuff anymore. It's just an unfortunate side effect of like how our society works, is that we get there's so little for this kind of like cultural information and cultural preservation and research and understanding. And it's just always a fight to keep it, because when it's tied to politics and elected officials, like what their priority is not necessarily going to be the priority of the cultural institutions in their district or under their kind of purview. So as much as I hate academia and it's like very, very challenging, like that's why universities are really important, because they continue, even though it doesn't seem like there's a lot of jobs for archaeologists or museums, like they continue to produce people who will advocate for those things, even if it's not the place that they end up like in a career.
I still got
So,
changes for universities. I think they should add it.
oh yeah.
It seems way too easy to sway their opinions with just a little bit of money, and I know how that's a lot of things are. But like for instance, with archaeology, are you able to bounce your research teams from state to, or not state to state, but country to country? Like, are you able to send someone to Germany to go work over there? Are you able to send someone over to Australia to go work over there and be a researcher? And do you have free range to do so? In my opinion, I know there should be a lot of things that you should be united under a united front when it comes to like all of us, but like with this fighting over the ship, whether someone wants to say that's not it, I'm not 100% sure it's that. I look at that like this would be 1,000 times easier if everybody was on the same kind of team, not looking at a country's discovery versus another country's discovery, and that boils down to like United Nations type thing, where there's like a specific team invested in that just to be able to explore free range wherever they want, no matter what area that they're in. It can't just be, oh, that's Japan Sea, so they can only look over there. Well, no, it should be an open access for the cultural heritage of society and the human species in general. Now, there's obviously many things when it comes to United Nations that you could probably put a research team under, like when it comes to space, when it comes to whatever. That's just the thought I had, because you're seeing a lot of infighting between personal things and it's just really about the maintaining of egos, I would say.
Also, United Nations does have an agency. It's called UNESCO, and so UNESCO deals.
Sleeping
It's
pill.
like I forget the whole acronym for it, but UNESCO deals with things that are critically endangered, right? So there's all these UNESCO World Heritage sites, and they are sites that are heritage that is important to the entire world. And it's kind of like an extra, not necessarily an extra layer of protection, but it's an extra recognition, designation, opportunity for funding, to say that these sites are really important to everybody. And so that's kind of like where they play. Where it kind of becomes difficult is that like up until very recently, and by recently I mean like the last like 50 years, the way that we've looked at our past is like, if you think about like colonialism, right? Like the British Museum is full of stuff that is taken from all over the world. Like the Smithsonian equally has things from all over the globe that they didn't necessarily like. It's not as controversial as like things in the British Museum, but things that they didn't necessarily like acquire in a way that holds up to today's standards. And so essentially the Western world had a monopoly on historic research and historic studies. And so they researched, studied, and took artifacts that aligned with what was in priority to them, right? So like tons of stuff from the Middle East because of like the Bible and Christianity, tons of stuff that was like exotic and, or exotic, I say in quotes, because it's not actually exotic, it's like someone's culture. But what is like discounted in that is that like, let's say we're talking about Incas, Mayas, and Aztecs, right? And like in Latin America, there is like really, really great, really, really fantastic Latino and Latina archaeologists doing fantastic work in Mexico, in the entire Latin world, but we don't necessarily see them, right? Because we say like, oh, you go and explore in this other country, but we don't necessarily reciprocate that. Like, so the problem kind of starts with us. Like, we're not bringing, Egyptian archaeologists to the Southwest to study like, the Pueblo people. but we're sending tons of people to Egypt to study Egyptology. So like what the real issue is that it's not a two-way street, right? Like we're sending people to say, we're sending people to Africa to study like the foundations of where humanity came from. But how many people from, say, Kenya are coming to the United States to study, early American archaeology? Or, we send people to England to go look at stuff over there. And some English people come over here to look at stuff, but like, it's not a two-way street. So it's still kind of like a colonial mindset. And until we can kind of be like, yeah, there's researchers in Brazil who want to come to Canada to look at the Inuit like sites. And then there's Canadian archaeologists who want to go to Chile. And then there's Chilean archaeologists who want to go to Australia. Like until it's kind of like we are open to people, not just from the westernized societies going and doing this kind of work, it's not going to be equitable.
Well, knowledge is power, and whoever has all the knowledge has all the power in a sense. I mean, it's not a two-way street in the aspect of maybe we're sending people over to the UK and they're not sending anybody over here, but would it be our job to hire more UK people to come over here, or should the UK be just more open to sending people over there? I feel like everyone's mindset's a little bit different.
I think what's missing though is like you miss out on completely different perspectives, right? If everybody who's looking at one shipwreck and one site says like, oh, has the same perspective, right? Like we're all, everybody, it's like all men. And then they're like, oh, what is this object? And a woman walks in and is like, oh, that's like a corset, or like they, no, it's the same thing. Like if you say like, okay, we have all of these Western people looking at this indigenous site, and then you bring someone from a different culture who might have something similar, and they're like, oh, actually, you guys thought that was a ritual object, but it's actually this like farming implementation, and people used it historically over here as well. You're just missing out on perspectives and clues and like a wider picture. And it's because like the institutions that have had archaeology and history have been very exclusive and have excluded people who are different for a really, really long time. So as much as like academia is a place where you can do research, like one of the problems I have with academia is that it's just not open to everybody. Like it's just not, like in archaeology, there's definitely more female students than there are male students, and yet there's way more male professors. Like it's just there's definitely there's a lot of diversity in undergraduate people wanting to pursue anthropology, but then when you kind of go higher and higher, that diversity just like completely disappears. So there's a lot to be gained. There's a lot that could change.
A lot of changes.
Yeah.
I have some ideas too on it. But I want to take the interview cap off. Like I was telling you in the beginning, I want to get down to like the interview kind of side of things. And also I got questions. First of all, you brought up one of my favorite topics. It's the mine and the Aztecs. Gold, treasure, buried treasure. Where is it?
It's nowhere. The conquistadors stole like a ton of it. Like anytime you hear about a Spanish treasure galleon, it's because they were just like pillaging everything from that culture and that country. And it's really unfortunate because there was probably these like amazing, beautiful artifacts and items, and they just like melted it down, shipped it back to Spain. That's why Spain was like the richest country for so long, because they were just like draining the lifeblood out of Latin America.
Okay. Still topic of buried treasure, but buried treasure pirates. Go.
Well,
everyone had a map. Everyone had treasure. Everyone had their own personal gold buried. So if they got lost at sea, if a map goes underwater, you don't have that treasure anymore. Tell me.
Okay. Tell me this. You have like 30 friends, right? You all like to drink. You're all kind of poor and irresponsible. And you say, okay, here's a chest of coins. And the 30 most drunk, irresponsible people know where this chest is. Is it still there?
I like to think that I have 30 friends. I couldn't get that out. I kept laughing. No, that's true. Yeah, I guess they would steal it. But I mean, how many ships gone down with treasure inside? I always hear about people finding gold in the bottom of the sea.
I mean, there are some, but not nearly as many as people think. Like and there's actually a movie coming out about one of these companies that treasure hunted and like the legal battle they got into. So let's say you find a Spanish treasure galleon, right? That still belongs to Spain. That still belongs to the crown, to Spain. So even if you find it, which is great. Like it belongs to Spain. You don't get to keep any of that. It's not,
I don't tell
it's for Spain.
anybody.
And it's the same for, well, how are you going to, when you take a coin off of there and you sell it, how are you going to justify where you got that from?
Black market.
Well, maybe, but if
Dark
like
realms of the internet.
someone would kind of put two and two together. There's enough people who are genuinely interested that like people will put two and two together and be like, oh, this must have come from this. And how did you, that means this person found it and this belongs to the crown. It's the same with US vessels. Like
they found the lost tablet of Gilgamesh at a fucking Hobby Lobby for $50 million.
Well, that's because Hobby Lobby is like the worst. I could go on all day.
I can't believe they had a tablet of Gilgamesh in there. It's just saying it sounds like Lord of the Rings, where I'm like, that has to be old.
Okay, so Hobby Lobby though, like they literally bought looted antiquities from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and the people who sold them to them were like people that we were in an active like war with. Like by buying illegal, like illicitly traded antiquities from those regions, anytime in the last 20 years, you are directly funding terrorism.
Wait, hold. Is it just one Hobby Lobby or is it all Hobby Lobbies?
It was the CEO of Hobby Lobby. The CEO, the person who owns Hobby Lobby, decided to buy all these illegal antiquities from the black market, which was directly supplied by people from ISIS. So like he was buying these elite, like, so when everything started going down, ISIS decided, like we don't want, they blew up like ancient statues of Buddha. They blew up ancient ruins. They killed and murdered archaeologists. They pillaged museums.
Hobby
and then
Lobby
they
did
sold
this or ISIS?
ISIS did this.
Okay.
And then they sold all those items in the black market.
Well, I've worked with ISIS at one point on accident. You don't know what Twitter spaces you're getting into. Half the time you're sitting there like, what? I'm listening to Dane Cook give out motivational tips because he does that now on Twitter. And then one Twitter space I was in, it ended up turning into an ISIS meeting. And I was like, what? Where am I at right now? You don't know because you're
get out of there.
The algorithm starts sending you into some things. I'm trying to look up conspiracy theorists. It links me with ISIS.
When you're purchasing antiquities, when you're purchasing ancient artifacts, you can easily track where they came from. And they knowingly purchased artifacts that were stolen and taken and excavated by people who are funding terrorist operations and paid a lot of money for that because they wanted to build their Bible museum or whatever. So I don't shop Hobby Lobby ever. Yeah, and multiple other higher up people,
because we all have family we don't talk about, and I feel like he's like would be the family you don't talk about. But I mean, is that so? That's just a corrupt thing in its own. So it's built on a foundation that's kind of a little bit corrupt in a sense. I mean, what's the appeal on that? The appeal is getting something that a lot of people haven't seen before. I mean, Hobby Lobby sells stuff, doesn't it? So like you're selling.
Yeah, they weren't selling anybody's artifacts. Like they were using their money to promote their like really conservative Christian ideas, and they were trying to build like this Bible museum, I think. But also there's like this appeal of having things that no one else has and no one else has seen. And there's like a whole upper echelons of like collectors, of people who collect things that are very, very valuable. And you can see it like in the art world too, right? Like if you buy a Van Gogh and you put it in your apartment and no one else can ever see it, like part of the appeal is that you own the only one and no one else can see it, So it's the same thing with ancient artifacts. But in the case of Hobby Lobby, particularly, they were just buying things that were illegally procured and then kind of keeping them secret. And especially the area that they were buying and the events that were going on there, it just makes it like more and more kind of despicable.
Do you ever Google search like stuff that you're researching with your work, I would say, and then see if you can find anybody selling maybe a fake thing? Like, people go like, here's Britney Spears's bra, and it's really not Britney Spears's bra, but they say it is, and the value goes up, that's the only thing I could ever hope to establish in my life, is that I could raise the property value. Like that's amazing in its own. But I'm just saying, do you ever like go and do like a Google, like let's look on Craigslist? I don't know if you have Craigslist down there.
When I worked for the state, I would have to do some of that we would be like, oh, there was somebody illegally digging in this area. Let's see if we could find out who it is based on like what is posted on eBay or Facebook or Craigslist. So a little bit of that, but honestly, like it's a rabbit hole that once you go down, it's just like, to me, is just utterly heartbreaking. Like I can't look at it. It just makes me sick to my stomach because people have so little regard for things. Like if you look at specifically like a lot of Civil War stuff. So like, let's say you go on to eBay and you're like, yeah, I want to find some Civil War artifacts. Oh, look, this person is selling like a case that has like some shot, a Monet ball, some buttons, a clasp. The reason that they have those things is because they either went and dug up on a battlefield, or they dug in a Civil War encampment, or they dug at a cemetery. Like that's it. They went and took a metal detector to a battlefield or a cemetery, and they dug stuff up, and then now they're selling it. So yes, it's really cool. And there are a lot of very amazing people who are not professionals, who are great researchers, who are good at finding stuff, who work with museums and other professionals. But then there's this whole other contingent of people who buy things to sell them, that think they're going to get rich quick. But to me, what it is like, it's just disrespectful to that site. Like, it's great, like, cool, you went to the battlefield at Gettysburg. It's an interesting site to go to. You can walk around there now. They have a visitor center, but at the end of the day, a lot of people died there, And so for me, if I'm just like, yeah, I want to find something, I need a souvenir, like that just doesn't feel right to me. And I know other people get really into it and they get really excited about it. But a lot of artifacts that are sold online and illegal are that way. Like, you're disregarding someone's life, you're disregarding someone's whole, like the sacrifice that they made. And it's the same thing. Like, there's these things, they're called slave tags. And what they are is like a metal number that at markets they would put on these individual people. And then that way they could keep track when they were selling people. And so there's people who like collect those, and there's not a lot of them. And they're an artifact that people would like to study and to associate with like this horrible tragedy, a period of time that happened. But then there's people who are like, oh yeah, I just like went over to where I know the market was, and I started digging with the shovel, and I just found it, and now I'm going to keep it for myself. Well, like, that's a human life. That was like a person who wore that. That was somebody who was ripped from their home and their family. That's somebody who experienced horrible hardship and like had violence inflicted on them daily. But like, I'm really glad that you can just like keep it on your desk and look at it, or sell it on eBay and make $40. It's just like, it just doesn't sit right with me in a lot of ways, for a lot of things. And so I just don't look, because I'll just get mad and go on a diatribe like this.
Yeah, I didn't know I was going to open up a door for that. I mean, that's interesting. I like that, though, that at least you're passionate about something like this, because I think there's a large amount of history that we're probably missing because it's in somebody's basement. I just don't know, because I mean, from their perspective as well, too, it's like, what's the difference if I have it and selling it compared to a museum that has it on display? It's like, well, a museum that has it on display is giving it to information for people to come across, be open to the public, to be access into something, maybe a severe part of history. And to them, it's like, well, then the museum can buy it from me. And it's like, I mean, in a sense, sure, but at the same time, it's just right to donate it morally, just because you
But
shouldn't have been there
also,
taking it
if
in the first
you
place.
took it out of the ground and then you have it and then you give it to somebody else, it like loses half of its information.
What about Nazi
right?
memorabilia? Half the people that have Nazi memorabilia can't even give it to a museum because they don't want it. And it's like, that's their great grandfather who might have been associated with them, which makes them look like a piece of trash. But it's just weird how value is. Like, right now, I bet you could get so much funding to do anything if you just mentioned the word slave. But then if you start talking about like Holocaust stuff, they're like, we got enough Holocaust stuff. It's like, do we though? Do we?
I think though it depends on like what you're trying to do, right? Like, so if I go out right now and I dig up in my yard, let's say, and I find a bunch of artifacts, and then I try to go give them to a museum, part of the reason the museum doesn't want them is because it doesn't have any provenience. So provenience is the like context in which something is found, right? Like this, let's say like this shirt button, it means something different if it's in the historic foundation of a house versus if it's in the middle of a battlefield, right? The shirt button means something different in each place. But if I just pick up the shirt button and I hand it to you, like, yeah, okay, it's a shirt button from, the Civil War era. But if I found it in the foundation of a house, maybe it can say, oh, this individual soldier lived here, or this family lived here, or this person who participated in these 5 battles lived in this house. So it's probable that this button belonged to that person, which then we can say, okay, this button traveled on his jacket from battle to battle to battle, and then he brought it home. or this button was found in the middle of a battlefield, so we can assume that like a soldier lost it in the battle or died there, or was encamped here for 8 months during waiting through the winter, or whatever. We can figure out the story behind the artifact if we know exactly where it comes from. Now, if I just go pick it up and hand it to you and be like, oh, you have a museum that has some Civil War stuff, here's a button, we're like, okay, great, like this is a button that was on somebody's jacket. Like you lose half the story by losing the
Oh, yeah.
context.
Like,
So
not the same thing with arrowheads, because we really don't know where arrowheads have come from. But the original kind of point of arrowheads is that they had them littered and kind of scattered around because they were kind of some type of, I would say they're like not really a marking, but they're more of like a memento of that area that's supposed to stay there, and people just pick them up whenever they find them.
yes and no. Like you can say like, okay, so arrowheads, just like anything else, there's different styles related to different groups of people. There's different styles and they like evolve through time. So like, let's say I'm in an area that has like a lot of rocky outcroppings and I find 10 different styles of arrowheads. I can probably determine that like, oh, people were coming here to it's called napping, when you break off the pieces of rock to construct like a projectile point. So I can be like, oh, well, I have a style from this period, this period, this period, this period, and this period. So I can conclude from that this area was a place that people were napping and building their own, or constructing their projectile points for 250 years, because I have these 10 different types of projectile points. So that's like an interesting information. We're getting like the source of the material, where you can associate that area to one particular group of people, or maybe we're finding a bunch of different groups of people there. So we're saying, oh, like even though these different groups didn't necessarily always get along and they were, moving around a lot, they were all coming and sourcing their material from this one place, or it's like communal. So we can get a lot of information, right, by just knowing the spot that they're coming from. Unless you just pick that up and walk it away and be like, yeah, this is a projectile point from this area of this group of people. You still lose half the story when you pick it up off the ground and move it to a different place. The other thing is like the things that are there associated with it can tell you a lot too. So let's say we're talking about arrowheads, projectile points. So you're at that place, you find 10 different ones, and then you take a soil sample there and you go through and you find different kinds of like pollen and seeds, but everything that's there is just associated with like the springtime. So it's like, oh, this pollen is from this flower that's only in the spring, and this seed only, they ate it and it moved over here. It doesn't grow anywhere around here. So you can then conclude like, oh, maybe these people were only using this site in the spring and they were doing work at a different site in other seasons. So you can, the provenience, like the where the thing is found, tells you the majority of the story. The object itself only tells you part of the story. And so you need, like, yes, it's really cool to have a bunch of arrowheads or to have a bunch of projectile points, but if you hand me a piece of pottery, right, from the Southwest, let's say, I'd be like, yeah, this is from this group of people from this time period. But if I find it in a cave with hundreds of other pot shards, then I know that this was probably like an important space, like an important spiritual space or a ritual space, rather than just like, oh, here's this really cool piece of pottery. So the context, like the provenience of exactly where it came from, is the part of the story that we're more interested in. The artifact is cool, but the rest of it is what tells us about history and people and culture and all the things that are, that we actually want to know about, that contribute to like our knowledge as humans.
I guess the difference between you and an average person is that an archaeologist probably looks at something and goes, this is a key to unlock a deeper part of history, when an average person goes, this would be cool to put in like a museum.
Yeah, but then when you go to the museum and you're like looking around and you see something, and like, would you rather see like a tag that's like pottery, New Mexico, or would you rather see like ritual pot from like a cave in New Mexico associated with these people? Like, what
Unless
would you rather see?
Unless, I mean, I know it's got obviously going to be the second one. Everyone's going to say the second one. You expounded longer on the explanation for it, so obviously that's the answer. But what I'm saying is, like, virtual reality wise is going to get to a point where you can actually see that pot being used, even though it's in place somewhere. They just have like a scene that plays around it to show you that type of thing, kind of like a reenactment in a sense. But I mean, I wanted to say this in the beginning, but I didn't know when to throw it in. But do you think eventually that this is going to be tossed into a type of AI thing that starts doing it for you, like more machine than actual archaeologist, even though it might be an archaeologist controlling the machine, but with deeper parts of the ocean that you can reach under by using a machine? I mean, using a sub in general or using scuba gear, that works too. You can go deeper with a submarine. But what I'm saying is an aspect of like, do you think it's going to be full machine that takes over the whole job field in a sense because it's just easier to access it that way if you have an AI system that's able to scan and find rather than a person controlling that machine?
I think there'll be some of that. I don't think that there'll ever be like all of that. But I mean, it's already for deep ocean stuff, it's already going that direction, right? Like we already use autonomous underwater vehicles and remote operated vehicles underwater to be able to access these depths because people just can't get there. And there's definitely people who are developing different kinds of technology to have like finer motor skill movements with these machines and different things like that. I think that there will always have to be like a pilot, like somebody who's like, yeah, pick up this, not that, especially in the underwater environment, just because, like colors are different, shapes are different, like growth on things is different. And so there are people who are trying to train AI to like process through data more quickly. But again, it's just not, it's like 50 to 60 years away from being able to do
You
really
say
what
that,
like,
but is it though? Is it?
I mean, I've worked on some of it and it definitely is.
I'm like
You're
I'm
like,
dead scared on like the fact that I mean I'm happy that we can get to parts that we can't get to through human capabilities, but I also see the goalposts keep moving to eventually. I mean, it kills half the fun of going on an adventure or a trip. Or, we talked about on your first episode driving out, in the middle of the ocean or something like that to go do a dive, and then I mean, as much as it might suck being cold or doing that, the discovery that you find and the enrichment and the memories that you have, I mean, that's also part of like the whole thing as well too.
I mean, the discovery will still be there, right? Whether or not you're using like remote operated vehicles or different technology, like this discovery part of it will still be there. Like the exciting of figuring it out and like closing the puzzle, I think will always still be there. But there's just like so much more that we can do now. I don't know if you've looked at, they did a study in Latin America with LiDAR. And so they kind of like scanned the whole entire forest and they found hundreds of more structures than they ever knew were there, like in the Yucatan. So like, there's like the Aztec like temples and things like that. And so they knew where like a bunch were, but then they did this LiDAR study and they do some other stuff with like moisture where you kind of look at the tree density to see how water is like absorbing into the ground. And if there's like a man-made structure there, it might absorb less or more depending on a lot of different things. But they took this huge swath and found hundreds of structures where literally archaeologists were walking past them and we're like, oh, that's just a hill, or oh, that's just this, and found all these structures. And that discovery, even though it was done with satellite imagery on a computer at someone's desk, like it's still just as exciting and like fulfilling as if they had been like hiking through the jungle. And now because of that, they can go hike through the jungle and like be like, okay, we're going to go to this and we're going to look at this specific thing. And it's the same with underwater, like we use remote sensing equipment. So we use sonar and magnetometers to look at the ocean floor. And so you might be out, we call it mowing the ocean. Like you might be out there for days, just like driving in lines, towing the stuff behind you, looking at the ocean floor. And then when you're processing the data and you're like, oh, this, we call it a target. So we're like, oh, this is a target. This looks like it could be something. And then you get to go back and like explore those targets and like make more discoveries. And honestly, if there was a robot that wanted to go out there and like mow the ocean for me for 2.5 weeks, so I didn't have to sit on the boat and do it, that would be totally fine.
Well, I'm agreement with that. I think I was talking about more like the personal, once you find it and you go down to actually explore. I don't want to see that be taken over by machines. But also you just gave me a new idea of like, why aren't people just paying cruise ship liners to haul this equipment but behind them to sense this stuff? So then how many people go on cruise ships? Everyone's going on a cruise ship all the time. And sometimes they don't come back. But I'm just saying, you have someone going on a Disney cruise, have Disney. That's where Disney leaks in. Okay, we're in it. I'm in.
No,
I'm in.
so the only problem with having other ships do it is that you have to keep like a very consistent speed and you have to kind of constantly adjust. So like
Trying to get this
you,
cowlick down. Hang
oh no,
on.
you're good. So like if you think about like if you think about a magnetometer, like say think about it like a lawnmower, okay? And you want the lawnmower to be flat, right? But then you add the ocean and the ocean has waves. And so it's going up and down and pitching. It's called pitch and yaw, like it goes up and down and side to side. So you're constantly like having to adjust based on like the weather conditions, the weather, like the water temperature, how salty it is, like all these different variables. And so we can program something to do that, but you have to kind of sit there and be like, okay, you know, it's still going, or like watch it. And if we were to like throw it behind a cruise ship or behind like, you know, say like a cargo vessel that's going across the ocean, what has, because people have tried that before, what has happened is like you get the data back and it's all just garbage because no one noticed for 4 days that like the thing that monitors like the side to side was off, or no one noticed for 3 days that when it was supposed to be 20 feet under the water, it was just like floating at the surface.
Or some
So
person tossed a lobster roll and it knocked the thing out of calibration, and now you got this thing.
yeah, there you go. Somebody was on the cruise deck having a little too much fun, a little too many drinks with umbrellas, and just stopped paying attention. But
uh,
we might get there eventually. Like it would be cool. Like there is an effort right now to map the entire ocean. So they say it's going to take 20 years, but there is an effort to map the entire ocean floor. So we'll
is
see.
there a fear, an overall fear of that there might be something to be unlocked at the bottom of the ocean?
I don't think so. I think people are just, there's so much we know more about space than we know about the bottom of the ocean, because like we can we can get into space a lot easier as humans than we can into the bottom of the ocean, right? Because you have like pressure, light, depth, needing air, all this different things. I think there's like a lot of life forms and like clues to the history of the planet in the deep ocean. But I don't think there's any like Godzilla is not gonna like come out if we like go too
I
deep
was
and
thinking
you
more
know.
like weapon wise, like from uh, another country or something like that. But I was trying to bring this up. There's a guy I just listened to his podcast. It's a person, you know what the younger dryas theory is?
Mm-mm.
It's kind of like the Earth has global resets, and it's happened multiple times. They don't actually think it's going to be like climate change isn't just global warming; it's actually a global freeze, which there's been accounts about, and it's kind of like high. It's by Graham Hancock. I don't know if you know who he is, but there's another person who said it. So it's Randall Carlson is a person that proponents this younger dryas theory, and they also did an 18-hour lecture on Atlantis, and they actually think it's off like the coast of Spain. I was just wondering what your thoughts on that would be. I mean, you have to think of a person's a philosopher like Plato, and he's coming up with such amazing quotes that we still use today. Was he creating a story with Atlantis, or was it an actual place in a sense? I mean, I know they found underwater temples before. And my idea would be erosion or something, not erosion, some type of climate shift that knocked something into the water and it just kind of sunk down there. But I'm just getting your
I
thoughts on it.
think Atlantis is a fable. I think that Atlantis was a story that was told to tell people that you can't like grow too fast. You can't put your own morals above everyone else, and that there is consequences for actions. Um, so no, I don't think that Atlantis is real. I think that the part of the Mediterranean that people contribute Atlantis to being in is very volcanically active with lots of faults and lots of big storms. And so, of course, like things go into the ocean. If you look at Alexandria in Egypt, there's tons of stuff underwater there because big parts of the ancient city have now become submerged. So, but no, I don't. I think Atlantis is a story, just like, you know, have you ever read Plato's like cave fable with
Mm-mm.
the shadows on the wall? So like there's this fable with like of Plato's where, you know, you're locked in a room and or you're locked in a cave and there's other people locked in a cave and there's a fire, but all you can see is the shadows on the wall. And so you kind of make your perceptions about the world around you based on just like what you can see, these shadows on the wall. And so you think they're monsters, or you think they're going to eat you, or you think, you know, it induces fear. But then when you leave the cave, you realize it was just other people. And that there's this whole other world outside the cave you didn't know about, because all you had ever been exposed to is the shadows on the wall. Now, I don't think that cave is a real place, you know, like I think it's a story like that Plato told to teach a lesson. And I think Atlantis is the same thing. I think it's a story that was told to teach a lesson. And as cool as it would be if it existed, I don't think it's real.
Damn, you taking out Hobby Lobby, then you taking out my Atlantis thing too. Okay.
Sorry, you know, anything else you love that I can just like kill real quick?
No, I still have hope for Atlantis a tiny bit. I look at it like the vast amount of the ocean. I just wonder if there was ever something. I mean, we're probably not going to find what they would describe as Atlantis or what Plato probably created as Atlantis, but definitely there's been underwater temples that have been found. I bet you there's some stuff under there that could be a key missing piece in history. I mean, if you look at the timeline of things that we do have compared to the timeline of things we don't know, that we don't know, that infinite possibility is a lot like space, where I start looking at it, a concept of like, there's going to be something that could be insert this here. You thought this, you know, this happened at this time period. And then 10 years later, it was this, when actually there's this 10-year gap that we have now. Like you have to look at it from a breakdown kind of standpoint.
Well, I think the other thing about history is that you have to remember that the majority of human history on Earth, there was no written accounts of it, right? Like there was no books, there was no written language. And so the majority of human history, we just don't know that much about, and we're not going to know that much about. We can like, you know, we can pull clues and learn things, but we're not going to be able to learn the same kind of things that we learn from like letters and historic documents, right? It's more like overarching things that we can learn from the ancient past versus like the more like, you know, like the nearer past. So there's always going to be things that we just don't know. There's always going to be things to learn. And I mean, that's like what keeps it exciting. Personally, I feel like I'm just like a cheater. That's why I do historic archaeology, because there is a written record and I like to use those clues. But there are definitely tons of people who do, you know, either prehistoric or pre-contact.
Or futurists. I worry about the future.
Well, there's actually a study going on right now where they're literally looking at like debris from the first space missions in an archaeological like mindset, which is pretty cool. I think it was like in the New York Times a while ago, there was like a comic book kind of style article about like 150 years from now, somebody going into like the International Space Station and like looking through it in an archaeological way. It's going to crash into the ocean in 2041, I think. But you know, like there's new frontiers, and like as we keep growing and going, we just are creating more cultural heritage and material culture that we're leaving behind. So there'll be more stuff to study.
Trying to think. I don't know what I'd be curious more about. I've talked to plenty of space people, but I'm more curious about what's in the bottom of the ocean. Not that I'm worried about like there's some secret kraken under there, even though that would be my hopes. More, I just feel like there's just something that would completely probably, maybe it's a renewable source or something like that. There's going to be something that's going to be at least amazing for human innovation. I mean, human innovation, I know we say like in the next 50 years or so, but I mean, it's moving at such speeds that I think is unpredictable in a sense. Where I mean, I'm seeing AI stuff that comes out of nowhere where it's like, this is going to completely revolutionize some things. And that kind of scares me a little bit, because with every invention that we let into our lives, or everything that becomes easier, you're losing an aspect of maybe what you've been doing for so long, because it's like adapting to a more comfortable climate, I would say, which has its goods and bads. I mean, I don't want kids to suffer or anything from like bullying, but also bullying might be foundational in an aspect of you get like a Mike Tyson character or something like that. Obviously jokingly, but there are some things where it's like a lot of people like that, a skill of building a house back in the day, like my great grandparents could do. I couldn't do that now. It's not necessarily, it's just a path that wasn't, it's branched off in a different way, where I see like two different timelines of evolution of humanity. And I don't think any of it's ready for space travel yet. I think everyone needs to kind of understand, if you're going to colonize on another planet, you should get all your shit together on this one first.
Yeah, I don't think that going to another planet is the answer. I think that the deep water innovations that like will actually affect our day-to-day lives will probably be more medical. Um, I suspect that like as we discover new deep water species and do, more evolutionary studies on like bioluminescence and cell generation and longevity, like why these animals are like living for hundreds of years, like all those different things, that a lot of the information that would actually affect us day to day would be kind of in the medical realm. But I also think that, different things spur technological innovation, and you don't know how those innovations are going to kind of like carry on. Like, we wouldn't have cell phones if we didn't have like radar and radio, right? Like those are the things that kind of spurred in. So who knows? But I mean, it's a cool field to be in. I wish it was more accessible to more people because it's just so expensive to like go out and do submersibles and do submarines and stuff. I don't know if you watched Will Smith's documentary. I think it's on Disney Plus through Nat Geo, but he went in a submersible and it's a great episode. Like I learned things I had no idea about. Like it's really, really interesting. So I would suggest that. And I think they give like a more comprehensive idea of the deep water stuff that's like around marine biology rather than my deep water stuff, which is like shipwrecks.
That's cooler though. Shipwrecks are awesome. I mean, it's
Shipwrecks are
not
pretty cool.
awesome for the people that were on it if it went down with people on it, but I'm just saying it's awesome to find. I mean, it's got to be amazing. Like you going on these dives, like I would have to say before we wrap it up is when you see one of these ships that's wrecked or something like that, or if you come across anything, I mean, that's the feeling that you probably get in your brain. Your face has to light up. I mean, at the aspect of you just found something that it could be nothing or it could be something, but either way, you're getting the same joy out of it.
It's no, it's fun and it's exciting. I think when you start doing it professionally, you have to like delay the excitement, right? Because you like have a job to do. So you're like, okay, I'm diving and I'm going and I'm documenting. And then you like get back on the boat and turn in your notes. And then you're like, oh my gosh, that really just happened. Like it's like a delayed reaction because you have to do all these things in your job. But yeah, it's still really fun. And that's like what keeps it exciting and like why people keep doing it, because it's a really hard field to be in too. Like, there's not a lot of jobs, not a lot of money. You might like, I haven't been in the field now for how long has COVID been going on? Like 2.5 years since I've been
Forever.
out. So, even though I haven't been out in 2.5 years, like it's still like the prospect of it like keeps me excited. So
And where can people find you, Jess, besides the Facebook page, which I'm a top fan? I have my
yeah.
badge and everything from it.
I am everywhere at Jessica the Archaeologist. So jessicathearchaeologist.com, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, which I don't use very often. And one of these days I'll get my YouTube channel going. Just,
Still waiting out for that one as well too.
well, it's there. It's just a matter of like, kids, job, life, work, sleep, eating kind of thing.
I feel you. Not on the kids one, I don't have any that I know of. Now, when people say that, it's the dumbest thing. But I appreciate you for doing the podcast, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.